would you please introduce yourself?
Well, I'm Curtis Loveless. Live here in Denton, Texas. Have almost my entire life, except for time in law school and the military.
Where'd you go to school?
I went to undergraduate at North Texas, and then to law school at the University of Texas.
Okay. And how long have you been practicing, or when did you graduate?
I graduated in 1969, so this is my 55th year.
Wow. Obviously, you're board certified in
Yes.
the practice of family law. Have you practiced family law your entire career?
Yes, and the reason I really got started in it is when I came to Denton County in 1969, there were 24 lawyers in the county, and they had all of the business that they considered good, which was personal injury, civil trial, probate, real estate. But they didn't want to do divorces, so they would refer divorces to a young lawyer who would take them. And so I did, and enjoyed it. And so then when board specialization came along, and they were talking about it around, I know by 1974, because in 75 they started it. But there was a lot of discussion about whether to do it or not. And
Across the board or just in family law?
well, some across the board. Remember, we were a small bar. And so the older personal injury lawyers had no interest. They had their practice the way they wanted. The younger ones were trying to get business, and so they did have interest in taking the criminal. And I think at first year there were only 3 specializations, which were family law, civil trial, and criminal. Mm-hmm. And then, after I made the decision to take the specialization exam in 1975, which was the first year, and I barely qualified because you had to be practicing 5 years to be eligible, and I was on my 6th, so I qualified. And they had a course that they held at the University of Houston in August that year. And I went and attended, I believe it was 1 week. And of course, most of the people there were older than me because I barely qualified, whereas some of them had practiced a good while. The Bob Piros and folks like that. So I didn't really know many of them, but went to the classroom, and it was sort of like a law school classroom with, lines of benches and all, and we sat there and went through it. And interestingly enough, several of the ones taking the test were also ones giving the lectures on issues. And so that was interesting.
Were those the same folks that were grading it?
No.
Okay.
No. And interesting story on that. Apparently, the specialization exam was written, I believe, by a law professor, probably at University of Texas. And apparently, before the exam was given, I believe Pat Nestor was the one who was head of the program at that time. And he contacted Don Royal, a lawyer in Houston that did family law and well experienced, and asked Don to just review the test and see what he thought. And Don reported later that he told Nestor, if you give this test, there will be no one that passes and specialization will be dead in Texas. And I've heard Don tell that story several times. I think maybe he's the one who graded it. I don't really know. Mm-hmm. But anyway, we took the exam, as I recall, I think in October, and then finally got the word early December that we'd passed. Mm-hmm. I don't remember exactly how many took the exam. There were a number that did not pass. And there were, I think, either 43 or 45 of us that did become board certified in family law. And so that's how I got started.
Can you remember, or what names do you remember from that first class of board certified family lawyers?
Phil Friday was one. I think Harry Tyndall was one. It's been a long time. I just don't remember how many got there that first time.
Well, let me ask this. You mentioned earlier that a lot of folks, especially here in Denton, said that they weren't interested in taking the board certification exam. What made you decide that you wanted to be board certified?
Well, partly because what I was doing. I was getting a lot of referrals on divorce work, family law. And I thought, well, if I'm going to do that, I probably ought to try to make sure that I know as much as I can, because I was probably I'm not sure of any other lawyers in Denton at that time that wanted to do divorce work. Now, a number of them did it, but it was not their choice. And so I think my thought was, if I'm going to do this, I want to try to, know as much as I can and really be the best one. And so that's why I think I decided to go do it. And I will tell you this, I was scared to death as the youngest one in the group down there.
Do you think that having that board certification with your name has helped you throughout your career?
Absolutely.
How
no
so?
question. Well, I think it's gotten recognition from peers first. I'm not sure what the judges thought about it initially. I think now, for many years, I think it has meant something to them. And assuming on how you practice and their opinion of you, which hopefully is going to be good, they will take your word quicker, I think, on issues than they might if they don't know, what your background is.
Mm-hmm. Do you remember anything about the application process for becoming a board certified family lawyer?
Very little. There's filled something out is all I recall.
What do you remember about the exam?
Well, the number one thing I remember about the exam is being scared to death. It does seem like there were a certain number of multiple choice questions, and then I'm thinking at least 3 essays.
Mm-hmm.
And that is kind of the same format that continued when I was on the exam commission that wrote and graded the exam in the 90s. Different questions and so on, but I think it again had multiple choice and some essay.
Mm-hmm. Tell us what you remember about the development of the Texas Family Code.
Well, of course, when I first got out of law school, I had no idea what I was going to do, and I did everything that I could, all the way from traffic tickets to court-appointed criminal cases and so on. So I didn't deal with family law too much for the first 2 or 3 years. And by that time, they had adopted the new family code and were beginning to make changes to it. And so there was an ongoing process, particularly in the earlier years. And I know that, for example, Jack Sampson and I can't recall the professor at SMU that was very well known, were sort of 2 of the main people that worked on and proposed things for the family code. Mm-hmm. And Louise Raggio and Reba Razor and some folks like that in Dallas had input into how that evolved and things that they did. to really get into that part of it, probably I did not do much until the mid-'80s when I became a member of the Family Law Council.
Mm-hmm.
Prior to that time, I probably had worked on practicing, trying to be a better lawyer, and being involved in the initial specialization organization, and then later when it morphed into TAFLS.
You mentioned the Family Law Council. When did that begin?
It'd been there for a while. I don't know exactly. I became a member, and I can't remember, roughly 1985, 84, 86, somewhere in there.
Mm-hmm.
And then that's when I began to become a lot more interested and involved in the legislative process. And for example, shortly after I got on, Chief Justice John Hill set out on a campaign to have child support guidelines. And the story was that occurred because his daughter got divorced over in East Texas, and he was very unhappy with the child support that was set. And there were wide variances around the state, with the metropolitan areas tending to be more and the rural areas being less. And so it was needed. And in that process, they had at first, John Hill wanted certain members of the Family Law Council. He didn't pick them, but I don't remember if it was 5, 7, 8 members of the council met and discussed and came up with some recommendations that were looked at by various ones. And I do know Mike McCurley and Mary Jo were part of that. I just don't remember who all. Based upon his work, I would think Harry Tyndall was involved in all of it. But some recommendations were made and sent out, and there was a outcry around many parts of the state about what is this, what do you mean, and you're taking away the power of the local judge, etc. And so I don't quite remember how that happened, but fairly soon thereafter, the Texas Supreme Court established a Texas Supreme Court Advisory Committee to study on it and make recommendations for child support guidelines. And they did, and I was one of the people on that committee. And sort of an interesting point in those early days, we heard from women who were divorced and men who were divorced. And each side had pretty strong positions. And the farthest one to one side that I recall is a lady came in that she had 3 children, and she and her husband were getting a divorce. And so she wanted to know about child support, and it's her opinion that child support needed to be based on the number of people in the family. And since she was going to have the 3 children, that was 4, and he would be by himself. So she thought she should get 80% of his income as child support. Well, the committee didn't think that was a good plan. And then, of course, on the men's side, it's one that we continue to hear today. And that is, the men would come in and say, she doesn't spend the money on the children, and if I'm going to pay the child support, I want her to have to document what she buys at the grocery store, what she buys in clothes, what she buys in food, and how much of each of those was for the children. And so, obviously, that didn't work, and compromises were made, and that's where the Supreme Court guidelines initiated, which were later adopted by the legislature.
That sounds like a lot hasn't changed in
On
Klein's
some
positions.
part of it, that's right.
Was that the same committee that worked with the Supreme Court Advisory Committee on a standard possession schedule
Yes,
as well?
they began to meet, I think, every 2 years, and I think there were 7 of those committees. The first 2 or 3 were on child support. By about the 3rd or 4th, we got into possession schedules too, and it was the same group. And again, heard from both men and women and tried to come up with possession schedules. And it gradually evolved. I mean, to know where it came from. When I started off, you had a divorce decree of 3 pages, and the possession said reasonable visitation or reasonable visitation on Saturday or maybe Saturday and Sunday. That was it. And so as we found, that didn't work too well. And so it began to get more specific. And then, of course, it has kept changing and changing to where it's got a lot of detail.
Mm-hmm. Well, going back to Family Law Council, because a lot of the members of our section aren't familiar with the work that the council does, how would you describe the work outside of what you've already told us that you did on council and what that's meant to you throughout your career?
Well, I think the council, in the entire time I was on it, and I'm sure now, was interested in what is happening in the law, what are the issues, etc. And, things like, quadros, we did not have those at one point in retirement and issues there. And so the council would have various people that's in committees that studied on certain issues and would report to the council. And then the council would make recommendations that they thought might be good for legislation. Of course, council could not lobby, and they can make comments, but we had no direct say-so in trying to sway legislation, which later on is why they had the Bar Foundation, the Family Law Bar Foundation that does lobby. And so all of that has evolved. So let me add one other thing. On council work, they would, like I say, study on an issue, and then frequently the people that were involved were also speaking at advanced courses and marriage dissolution and so on. And so that information would be then worked into a speech and disseminated so that others, would hear it and have that information.
Mm-hmm. On the topic of those courses, did you attend the first Advanced Family Law Conference 50 years ago?
I don't specifically recall, but I did not miss any for years. I mean, if you want to get down the first one, that was the prep exam in '75 before we were certified. And then we were there after it moved around from Dallas and Houston, San Antonio, and I went to every one for, I would think, at least 18 to 20 years, and it probably only missed 3 since I've been practicing law.
Out of all of those Advanced Family Law Conferences, what is your favorite memory, social or from the CLEs themselves?
Wow. I think my favorite memory would be the establishment of awards that for people who have done things. And so they have the Emerson Award. They have the lawyer from Austin, whose dad was the football coach at Texas in the 50s. and he was excellent, and then died fairly young. And those awards for people that that do the work, that receive those awards, I think is my favorite part of it.
What does that Sam Emerson Award mean to the family law section and to the recipients?
Well, Sam, I did not know Sam. I was just slightly, I got involved just slightly after, sort of, I think around the time he died. But he was apparently a person that had a lot to do with issues, with helping draft things, with influence on people that were working on family law, and he was very involved. And so I would say for those who knew him, he was I guess you could say, legend. And it was appropriate and to have an award for him. And like I say, those memories are very special.
I want to shift gears a little bit and talk to you about TAFLS. Do you remember when or why it was established?
Yes, I can't be quite as specific as I would like, but you go back, and as people were getting board certified after 1975, by about 1979, a lawyer in Houston named Tom Busquet, or it may not be the correct pronunciation, but anyway, he sent out an email to board certified, we didn't have email, he sent a letter, okay, to board certified lawyers asking if we would be interested in establishing an organization. And a number of us did. And so we had a very loose organization there at first. And there were some issues about the name, and it possibly conflicted a little bit with the American Academy of Matrimonial Lawyers. So discussion began to happen about how will we change this and have a more formal organization, which resulted in, well, there were about 11 people that were pretty consistently involved in forming it, which included my friend Jim Loveless. You had Paul Rothschild, you had Mike Gregory from Denton. I'm sorry, I can't recall all the names, but there were 11 that basically did it. And it was formed at a meeting in San Antonio, in which finally they said, okay, are we going to do this or not? And the decision was made that we were going to do it. And so, and I'm trying to recall, I think it's either first or second seminar that TAFLS had. It was in Las Vegas, and Jim Loveless and I were the co-directors. And that, I thought, went well. And again, on those things, it just started building. And, you know, has gone to where it is today, from a small number of people to probably at least 700. And
so I interviewed Jim Loveless a couple of weeks ago, and he mentioned that conference in Las Vegas. And he told me a story, and I'm curious if I could hear your side of the story, and I won't prompt you on which one it is, but I suspect you'll know.
Well, being Las Vegas, there are a number of stories. So without some general idea, I wouldn't begin to start down that rabbit trail.
I'll take that as the fifth. Do you remember when TAFLS really started to grow into what it is today, with the number of members and the work that they do?
I would think probably in the late 80s, I think it took several years, and then I think it began to take off by then.
Mm-hmm. And back when it first started, were there any minorities involved in TAFLS that you remember?
There were some women, and I don't recall beyond that any particular group or numbers.
When did you start to see the change where more minorities are part of the practice of family law?
Okay, well, let me say this. When I started here in 1969, there were 24 lawyers in the county, and there were no minorities of any kind that I recall. I know there were no women lawyers. I don't think any other minority had any representation. In about 2 years after I started, the first woman lawyer started practicing here, and she did some divorce work and other things. And then I would say it was several years, we might have gotten one or two, but it was several years before we began to get several. Mm-hmm. And of course today, I don't know how many hundreds of lawyers there are that live in Denton County and practice here. Mm-hmm. But my opinion is at least 50% of them are women and or minorities. Mm-hmm. And there's pretty good representation of both. One thing I might add about that, when I started practicing law here, there was one district court which served both Denton and Cook County. And then after about 3 years, we got a second district court, and about 2 or 3 more, we got a third district court. And then gradually it has increased where we have 9 now. And, it's been really a kind of an interesting change to watch that.
You mentioned before we started filming about the court reporter here in Denton County. Tell us about that.
When I started, there was an older guy that was the court reporter named Emery Ballard. And he took all of his court reporting notes in a little spiral notebook that he wrote on, okay? And I first thought that was pretty unusual and questioned it some until I found out that he had been a court reporter at the Nuremberg trials after World War II and was highly thought of for his skills. So that was interesting, and he was a wonderful person and tried to help young lawyers.
Was that back in the old courthouse on the square?
Yes.
And you told me that there was an interesting feature in that courthouse. Tell us about that.
Well, it's one that, in my opinion, it closely resembles the one in the movie To Kill a Mockingbird, where you have an upstairs balcony and people would go in and sit. And in this county, not too often would there be very many, but occasionally there would, and probably mainly a criminal case of some sort. And then you'd have people up there, and they had the old fans, was the only way that they had any cooling. And in those days, they allowed smoking in the courtroom, and there were a lot of people, lawyers, judges, etc., jurors that wanted to smoke, and they did, and it would get sort of foggy in there. But those were some interesting things. I might add one footnote on that. Smoking continued, and the judges, several of the judges smoked on the bench. And in about, I'm going to say about 1988, a lawyer here that did not smoke decided that he didn't want to breathe it anymore. So he set out on a crusade to eliminate smoking in the courtroom. And I think in the courthouse, but I remember the courtroom. And in fact, he apparently got some traction with the county commissioners. Well, when one of the judges that smoked all the time got word that that was going to happen and he might be ordered to quit, he was, what I want to say, he was furious. And he ended up calling this lawyer up, I think in the courtroom, and they had some argument there. Then they abandoned to his chambers, and I think it increased in volume. And I don't think they ever resolved it. I do believe the commissioners finally said there's going to be no more smoking in the courtrooms. And I will say to the end of that judge's career, which was fairly long, he never forgot that lawyer. And the lawyer never forgot him. And he tried to get out of that court anytime he could.
What other changes have you seen in the practice of law over the years?
Well, one that's amazing to me is the change in the technology. When we started off, documents were prepared by typewriter. If a mistake was made, they whited it out and typed in the right thing. And that continued until really the late 1970s. And in fact, our office, which had our partner was probably the top personal injury lawyer in the county, a guy named Jack Gray. And he fought having technology because he didn't need it. And finally, because of things in family law and other things, my other partner and I were about the same age, and we finally prevailed on him to let us get the first word processor. And we got it, and it was helpful. We thought it was amazing at that time. Today you'd think, what are you doing with that relic? And but the cost of it was $7,000, and our senior partner had a heart attack. We had to kind of work around that one. And of course now you look at all the things they have and how quickly you can do stuff, and it's helped a lot. Mm-hmm. And correction, you know, we have self-correcting processors that say you mistyped that word. Mm-hmm. And all that. So,
well, with that rise of technology, have you seen a change in the relationships among lawyers?
I think absolutely.
Tell us about it.
Well, when I started in, like I say, in '69, there were 24 lawyers in the county, and although I was the youngest one, pretty soon, well, having been from Denton, many of them probably kind of knew who I was. And so they were very receptive, and most of them considerably older, and were friendly and would help you if you asked for it. And that continued, and as we got more lawyers, there were things that, you know, there'd be interactions and all, and it was very friendly, collegial, where a docket call, for example, in those days, and this was when we had, I don't remember if it was 2 or 3 district courts, but they were general jurisdiction courts. And so there would be a docket call on Monday morning for everything in all the cases, civil, criminal, family, whatever. And so all the lawyers would gather there while that was being called, and they were very wonderful times where people visited, you know, when they weren't interrupting something or go out in the hall or whatever. And one of the funny things about going was to hear the excuses that lawyers would come up with for why they didn't want to go to trial. And we had one lawyer here in particular, a lawyer named Hal Jackson, who he was better than Johnny Carson. And I mean, he would have the crowd rolling by the time he got through with his excuses. And then, of course, there was always the standard excuse in criminal cases that stand up and say, "Judge, we're missing a witness, Mr. Green." And that meant that the lawyer hadn't been paid, and generally they'd get a continuance.
I'm gonna try that one.
Yeah.
Talk to us about what your typical work day or work week looked like back in, say, the 70s as compared to what you see nowadays.
Well, in those days, as I recall, we arrived at the office sometime before 8, all right, and generally went home probably after 6. One thing that was interesting in those days is almost all lawyers worked Saturday morning, and so we were in there and from 8 to 12 or so. And Saturday was also the number one day that most lawyers here took depositions. And so that worked out fairly well, because if you knew the time, then you could get in, take the deposition. If it was over by 11 or so, then you were through for the morning and the weekend. And that happened, and I have suggested taking depositions on Saturdays in recent years, and also been met with visions of horror about it. Why would you do that? So that has changed, I think.
Going back to TAFLS and focusing there a little bit, what are your thoughts on the organization nowadays?
Well, I think I haven't been as actively involved in how the organization runs, other than, seeing things that they've done for legislative issues, and so on. As far as I can tell, it's doing fine. I have no observations much in any way.
Okay.
I guess I'm in the if it ain't broke, don't fix it.
Well, lots of lawyers are going to be watching this video at Advanced Family Law this year. It's our 50th conference. What is it that you would want young board-certified lawyers to know about your journey as a family lawyer and a board-certified family lawyer? And maybe where they are now that you wish that you knew back when you became board-certified?
Well, the process, of course, is a ongoing one forever. What I think I would want them to know is sort of basic lawyer stuff, and that is, and as a specialist in particular, you have a duty to be a professional, and really a higher professional than others, in my opinion. And establishing that through, telling the truth, keeping your word when you say you'll do something, wanting to study, recognizing at times that is an issue that you do not know enough about, and either getting someone to help you or sending it to a different lawyer. The other one is the old standby. The worst decision a lawyer can make in taking a case is they need the money and they think, I'll do this. Well, that very seldom works out. I think the professional part of it, and the thing I enjoyed for so many years, is getting with other board certified lawyers, talking about things, and it helps the way you practice. And so, I don't know how to put it other than you just become more professional.
Mm-hmm.
And I do think, and pat myself and all the other board certified lawyers on the back, I think it brings you some standing and some appreciation for who you are. And it is satisfying.
Mm-hmm.
That's probably all I can think of right now.
Mm-hmm. Well, I'll end with this. What is your most memorable case? Not mentioning the names if you don't want to, but most memorable case that stands out in your mind from your career?
Boy, that's I will pick one, okay? And that is a fellow lawyer was representing a man, and I had tried a lot of custody cases by that time, in about '86. In fact, I'd tried a pretty good number of jury custody trials, and this lawyer had a jury custody case, and he wanted to know if I would just kind of sit there second chair and just sort of make sure everything went okay. And I said sure. So first time I ever heard of the case was on Friday. Trial was next Monday. So I met with the client and the lawyer Sunday afternoon, and they went through things and talked about it and said, well, there's nothing, in this case. It's just he's a good dad and he wants to have custody. I'm going, oh, okay, this sounds all right. So we go down there and pick a jury, and the other lawyer was a very good lawyer, and get the jury picked. Well, then they start in, they're going first, and I'm taking notes, just drifting along, and they've told me there's nothing bad about this case. About 3 questions in, they start unloading on this guy with how horrible he was in just one way after another. And I am now writing. I'm thinking, well, I want to hear how, my friend takes care of this, and so on, and a lot of things. And I'll mention this. As part of the jury, everybody had agreed, and there was a black lady on the jury. Well, one of the first things out of the wife's mouth is he's racially prejudiced. Well, now we're looking at that. And so it gets to about 3:30, and that lawyer passes the witness. And I'm thinking, boy, see how this goes. And that lawyer leans over to me and says, you got to take this witness. I said, what? He said, you got to take this witness. He had panicked, didn't know what to do. The judge is up there giving us the look and so on. So I do. I start questioning the woman. And the only thing I know to do is take her statements and try to pin them down and clarify them for an hour and a half until we get to 5 o'clock. And I get out and I can find out something about the case. Well, the first thing I find out is this racially prejudiced guy had volunteered to go to the Peace Corps in Africa for 2 years. So let me see. It did not sound like that was quite the situation. And we went on and battled it out. And then in the final argument, one of the things I did is quoted Robert Frost's poem about 2 roads diverge in a yellow wood. And the ending is, Frost says, I took the road less traveled by, and that has made all the difference. And I said, our client took the road less traveled by, and so on. Mm-hmm. And it ended up, we got custody of a 3-year-old and 5-year-old girl.
Wow.
That's probably my most memorable case.
Mm-hmm. Mr. Loveless, thank you.
Well, thank you.
We certainly appreciate the opportunity to hear from you.
Well, I appreciate visiting with you.